the strongest being in the entire universe, once lost a drinking contest. He lost a wrestling match to a frail old woman. He failed to lift a grey house cat off the floor. And then he learned what he had really been doing, and it terrified him. This story comes from the cold north of Europe, from Scandinavia, and from Iceland, where it was written down around 800 years ago by an Icelandic chieftain and poet named Snorri Sturluson. Snorri collected the old myths of the Norse, the gods of the Vikings, into a book we now call the Prose Edda. And the hero of this particular tale is the most famous Norse god of all, Thor, the thunder god, red-bearded, enormous, hot-tempered and strong, strong beyond strong. Thor is the muscle of the Norse cosmos. When the gods need something crushed, they send Thor. Now, you may know Thor from films, where he is a noble, gleaming hero. The Thor of the old myths is a little different. He is brave, yes, absurdly brave, but he is also proud, loud, quick to anger, quick to reach for the hammer. He is a god who has never, in his whole existence, met a problem he could not simply hit. And this story is what the Norse storytellers did to a being like that. They took the strongest character in their entire mythology, the one who measures the whole world by what he can lift and what he can break, and they walked him step by step into a hall where his strength meant nothing at all. So, let me tell you about the day the thunder god learned how small he really was. Thor set out on a journey into the land of the giants. With him went the trickster god, Loki. You will have heard of Loki. Keep him in mind. And with them went two human servants, a farm boy and a farm girl, picked up along the way. Their goal was a stronghold called Utgard, the great fortress of the giants, far out past the edges of the safe and ordered world. The journey was hard. On the first night, in a vast dark forest, they found shelter in a strange building, an enormous hall with a wide entrance and a smaller side room. They slept, and all night the ground shook, and a great roaring filled the air. In the morning they discovered the truth. The building they had slept in was not a building. It was the glove of a giant so enormous that his discarded mitten was the size of a hall, and the side room was its thumb. The roaring had been the giant snoring. And here is the first thing I want you to notice. Thor had stood all night inside something and had completely failed to understand what it was. He had mistaken one true small part of a thing, a hollow, a shelter, a room, for the whole of the thing. Hold on to that. It happens in this story again and again. And the last time it happens to the entire world. At last, the travellers reached Utgard itself. And Utgard was a fortress so high that to see the top of its wall, a man had to tip his head all the way back until his neck ached. The gate was barred. The travellers were so small beside that gate that they simply squeezed between the bars and walked in. Inside was a great hall crowded with giants, and on a high seat sat their king. His name was Utgard Loki, the lord of the giants' stronghold. And Utgard Loki looked down at Thor, at the famous thunder god, the terror of giants, the strongest being in the cosmos. And Utgard Loki smiled, the way you smile at a child who has wandered into a room full of adults. So said the giant king, "This is the mighty Thor. You are smaller than I expected." Now, the giant king went on, "It is the custom in this hall that no one may stay unless they can do some feat better than anyone else here. So, what can you do? At what are you the best in all the world?" And Thor and Loki and the two human servants, each of them in turn, stepped forward to be tested. And each of them in turn was about to be very, very thoroughly humiliated. Loki went first. "I can eat," said Loki, "faster than anyone alive." So a long wooden trough was filled with meat. Loki started at one end. A giant called Loki started at the other. They met in the middle. But while Loki had eaten all the meat, Loki had eaten the meat and the bones and the wooden trough itself. Loki had lost. Next, the farm boy. "I can run," he said, "faster than anyone." He raced a small, slight figure named Hugi. He raced him 3 times, and 3 times Hugi reached the end and had time to turn around and walk back to meet the boy before the boy had finished. The boy had lost. And then it was Thor's turn. "I will take," said Thor, "the drinking contest. There is no man who can outdrink the god of thunder." So the giant king's cupbearer brought out a drinking horn. It was a long horn, longer than most, but a horn is only a horn. "Here is the rule," said Utgard Loki. "A good drinker empties this horn in 1 swallow. A merely decent drinker takes 2, but no one here is so feeble that they cannot finish it in 3. Thor put the horn to his lips, and he drank. He drank the great deep drink of a thirsty god. He drank until his breath gave out, and when he lowered the horn, certain he had emptied it, he looked inside. The level of the drink had gone down by almost nothing. He drank a second time, longer, harder. The level dropped a little. He drank a third time with the full, furious strength of the thunder god, until he could not draw one more swallow, and the horn was still mostly full. Utgard Loki looked down and shook his head, almost kindly. "So," he said, "the great Thor, not quite the drinker the stories promised." Thor was furious now. Furious and ashamed. "Give me," he said, "another task, a real one." "Very well," said Utgard Loki, and he smiled. "Here is a small thing, a child's game really. We have in this hall a grey cat. My young giants like to lift it off the floor. Let us see if the mighty Thor can lift our house cat." And a large grey cat walked out onto the floor of the hall. Thor strode over to it. He bent down, he put his hands under its belly, and he heaved upward with all his might. And the cat arched its back. That was all it did. As Thor lifted, the cat simply arched up and up, its back curving higher toward the rafters, and no matter how Thor strained, no matter how the great cords stood out in his neck and his arms, he could only ever raise a single one of the cat's 4 paws off the ground. One paw, the strongest being in the cosmos, lifted one paw of a house cat. Now Thor was past fury. "Let me wrestle someone," he roared. "Bring me a giant. I will wrestle the largest one in this hall." And Utgard looked around, and then he said, gently, almost insultingly, "I do not think any of my giants would lower themselves to wrestle you. But call in my old foster mother. Call in Ellie." And into the hall came an old woman. She was ancient, she was bent, her face was a map of wrinkles, and her hands shook, and she shuffled slowly across the floor toward the waiting thunder god. Thor almost laughed. He was being asked to wrestle a frail old woman. It was an insult. He half wondered whether to refuse, but his pride was already so bruised that he reached out to take hold of her. Gently, he thought, so as not to hurt her. And the moment Thor laid hands on the old woman, he could not move her. She did not seem to push, she did not seem to strain, but the harder Thor gripped her, the harder he heaved and twisted with all the strength of the god of thunder, the firmer, the more immovable, the more rooted the old woman became. It was like wrestling a mountain. It was like wrestling the floor of the world. And then, slowly, the old woman began to wrestle back. She took hold of Thor, and the mighty Thor, who had crushed giants, who had cracked mountains, who had never once in all his existence been overpowered, began to give way. His feet slid on the stone, his great legs shook, and the old woman, shuffling, bent, ancient, forced the thunder god down and down until Thor sank onto a single knee. And at that, Utgard raised his hand and stopped the match. "Enough," said the giant king. "Enough, Thor. You need not wrestle any longer." And Thor stood up off his knee in the silent hall, beaten. Beaten at eating, beaten at running, beaten at drinking, beaten at lifting a cat, and beaten at last to one knee by a shuffling old woman, and the strongest being in the universe did not know how any of it was possible. Thor and his companions spent the night in the hall, shamed and silent, and in the morning they rose to leave, and Utgard himself, the giant king, courteously walked them to the gate, and then, a little way beyond it, out past the wall of the great fortress. And there, outside, in the open, the giant king stopped, and he said something that changed everything. "Thor," he said, "now that you are outside my fortress, I will tell you the truth. And the truth is that I have deceived you from the moment you walked in. I am a worker of illusions, and every contest you lost last night, you did not truly lose. Loki, said the giant, did not race an eater. He raced a thing called Logi, and Logi is wildfire itself. Of course, the fire ate faster. Fire eats everything. Your servant did not race a runner. He raced Hugi, and Hugi is thought. No creature alive, boy or god, can ever outrun the speed of a thought. And you, Thor, said the giant king, you I deceived most of all. The drinking horn, said the giant king. Thor, the far end of that horn, was joined secretly by my magic to the open sea. When you drank from it, you were not failing to empty a horn. You were drinking down the ocean itself. And Thor, go and stand on the shore now when you leave here. You will see how far the tide has gone out. You will see what your 3 swallows did to the sea. The grey cat, the giant went on, was not a cat. The grey cat was an illusion laid over the Midgard serpent, the monstrous snake that lies in the deep ocean and is so vast that its body wraps entirely around the whole of the world, and it bites its own tail. And when you lifted that cat until one paw left the ground, Thor, you lifted the world serpent until its coil came loose from the earth. You very nearly lifted the world apart. Every giant in that hall was afraid. And the old woman, said Utgard Loki, and now his voice was very quiet. My old foster mother, Ellie. Thor, Ellie is not a woman. Ellie is old age. Old age, Thor, and there has never been anyone, not one being, in all the long history of gods and men, there has never been anyone whom old age, in the end, could not bring down onto one knee. You wrestled the one opponent no one has ever beaten. And Thor, you only went down to a single knee. No one has ever done even that. And Thor reacted exactly the way the thunder god always reacts. He had been tricked. He had been humiliated. And so Thor's hand went to his belt, and he seized his great hammer, and he raised it to bring it down on Utgard Loki and shatter the giant where he stood. But the giant king was already gone. Thor turned, hammer raised, to strike the fortress itself, to bring down the towering walls of Utgard, and the fortress too was gone. There was no fortress, there was no gate, there was no hall, no giants, no grey cat, no old woman. There was only Thor and Loki and 2 human servants standing alone on a wide, empty, silent plain with a hammer raised over nothing at all. And this is the image the Norse storytellers wanted you to be left with. The strongest being in the universe, the god who had spent his whole existence certain that any problem could be solved by hitting it, standing on an empty plain with his fist in the air and no one to hit. Because the things that had truly beaten him, the fire and the thought and the sea and the world serpent and old age, those are not things you can swing a hammer at. They were never in the hall. They were never giants. They are simply how big the world actually is. There is one last thing to know about this story. We tell it usually as a funny story, a tall tale, the blustering strong man taken down a peg. Good, he had it coming. But the Norse were not a people who told stories only to laugh. They lived hard lives in a hard country, and their myths are full of a clear, cold wisdom. And underneath the comedy of Thor and the giants, there is one very serious idea. It is this: you measure the world with whatever you happen to be good at. Thor was good at strength, so Thor believed his whole life that the world was a thing you could lift and break and outmuscle. And because he was so very strong, he was never once forced to find out that he was wrong, until he walked into a hall built entirely to show him. And what the hall showed him was not that he was weak. Thor was not weak. He moved the ocean. He lifted the world serpent. He brought old age itself to a standstill, one knee short of victory. He was magnificent. The hall showed him something much harder to hear. It showed him that no matter how strong he was, the world was always, always going to be bigger. You have a hammer too. Everyone does. Something you are genuinely good at. Arguing, earning, charming, working, winning. And it is a gift. Use it. Be proud of it. But know this, friend. The day is coming. It comes for everyone, when you will face the cat that is really a serpent, and the old woman who is really age, and the horn that is really the sea. And on that day you will raise your hammer, and there will be no one to hit. So practice now. Practice being the kind of person who can lose a contest in a giant's hall and walk out onto the empty plain and lower the hammer and say, not in shame, but in wonder, how much bigger the world is than me.